Namani, Nai Nari Bonnie Brody, Nai Wakandi, Namani Nabudni, Ganamiyana. Hello everyone, my name is Bonnie Brody and I welcome you all on Ghanaland today. My name is Bonnie Brody and I'm the granddaughter of Veronica Brody. Some of you may have heard of her or might have met her. She had a strong voice and wasn't afraid to use it. She was a great advocate for the environment. It's great to be able to give a welcome to you today, and I hope you have a successful meeting, and I wish you all the best for this event. Thank you.
So my name is Ryan Hobart. I work with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, where we very much believe that good intentions aren't enough, right? We need to move beyond just trying hard and actually try to get to some good outcomes. And I'll be your MC for the day, but along with a large team of lots of other people that are making this event happen. And we will do lots of formal thank yous later. But wanted just to open the forum by saying, I guess, so after about 5 years as a South Australian, there's sort of a few key images or moments that stand out to me, right? So if I'm telling someone else about what it's like to live in South Australia, one of the first things is, you know, riding your bike to work through the parklands in the morning with a 10-minute commute, right? Or how close the hills and the sea are, yeah? There's also some really nice memories of, like, you know, particular night in the Fringe with lots of friends around and sort of that feeling of abundance. And then there's one particular morning sitting down Deep Creek with my partner in silence as the sun rose over the sea and touched the tops of the trees, right? And just that feeling of being connected and present. And I think that is some of the strongest memories I have, right, of 5 years of life. And of those, some of the most salient ones have to do with a connection to nature, right? And I'm very much not alone in that, right? So, like, in terms of South Australians, 7 out of 10 visit a state or national park every year, right? And it's not a statistic from one crazy survey. There's a few different bits of research that back that up. So one of them's a bit over 70%, one of them's right at 7 out of 10. And if you include beaches, right, in that, it gets to over 90% of people visit a state or national park every year. And of that 70%, the 7 out of 10, half of those visit between 4 and 12 times a year, so they go a lot, right? And if you ask South Australians, they say things like 94%, right, would agree that conserving the natural environment is of critical importance. I think this is astounding. Almost half would say they consider themselves strong environmentalists, which that floored me to hear. And 70% say there's not enough emphasis on protecting natural habitats, right? So when it comes to talking about the environment in South Australia, there's some good news that, like, people feel very connected to it on a personal level, like I was speaking about, then also on a collective level, we think it's important to some extent. There's also lots of bad news as well, and some other good news, right? Renewables are doing really well. South Australia is pretty remarkable in that regard. But there's lots of bad news around biodiversity particularly, right? And how things continue to decline despite our best efforts. And so I guess what this tells us is, right, we know that some things are working really well, but some things we really need to do differently. But that's an easy thing to say, but a really hard thing to figure out what exactly should we do. Like, what does that actually look like? So the whole point of Nature of SA was to try and answer that question. Yeah? So we all know that, well, many of you probably know that there was a statewide biodiversity strategy, no species loss, which expires this year in 2017. And so Nature of SA was set up to try to think about, okay, what do we do to replace that with? How do we think at a statewide level about biodiversity and conservation in a different way? But particularly, we didn't want to just do the same old things, right? And we're really concerned that we would just end up with another document that sits on a shelf, right? We wanted to make it really practical and useful. And so we wanted to go through a bit of a process where we didn't at the very beginning know what was going to happen, right? Which is, it takes a lot of bravery, particularly on behalf of government and lots of other people involved. And it's been quite a journey, and it's still lots further to go. But I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The way it's been structured is there's a working group that includes people from DUNA, Central and Regional, includes environmental NGOs from across the state, and then a few sort of people from other places, myself from the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, Paul Ryan from the Australian Resilience Centre, and a number of other bits of input from around the shop, including people from PIRSA and otherwise. So the whole goal of this was to go into the unknown with a bit of an openness in terms of we don't know what's going to happen, but an intention to make something that's more useful than just a piece of paper. Started with the working group, and then sort of grew to work a lot with various people in the environmental sector, which is what we've been doing mostly to date. In the future, working more with groups outside of that have an outsized impact on the environment and more of the general public. with the intention to produce a statewide strategy that doesn't just sit on a shelf, right? But also produce action and change in advance of even creating a written document. The process has looked like a bit of meandering at the beginning where we tried a few different things to figure out what we might do. And that was actually really important to try and understand what are we trying to achieve here. Then we had a bunch of sort of top-down conversations, some bigger workshops with lots of different groups, both inside of DUNA and inside of the environmental NGOs. Then a bunch of bottom-up conversations with smaller groups of people across the state. So those were with regional offices, those were with different organizations. Did some surveying as well of sort of reflecting on no species loss and what worked and what didn't work for that. Tried to got a broad reach of people, and then tried to synthesize all of that mess into some sort of things that we thought might be useful in terms of a shift from going from this is how things have been to this is how we would like things to be, or a way that we think could be useful and open up new possibilities in the future to getting the change that we want. Right? From that, we're now here, right? So you are here. You are at the forum. And the goal of the forum is to say, with all of this sort of consultation that went quite broad, and the conversations and the research, and then the shifts that were synthesized out of that, are those shifts the right things? Are they useful? Is this a good way to put it? What does that look like in practice? So this forum is about checking that. It's about checking back in and seeing if it's right. Out of this, we hope to continue to be able to have broader conversations, right? And we hope to be able to try some things out and test some things. But that's not just us as well, that's the sector as a whole. So we hope that out of this we can have some concrete actions about what would happen next with lots of different people. So like I said, you are here, talked to lots of different people across the state, did a lot of different kinds of consultation, came out with 9 shifts, and today is all about checking in, getting feedback, and getting permission and partnership for moving forward. So we think that some of the things that came out that were in the discussion paper and that you'll be discussing over the next couple of the days will be no-brainers and make a lot of sense. We think other ones will be maybe a little bit more contentious or unusual, but we're really excited about discussing all of that and getting everyone's input to sort of check in and make sure we're on the right track. The journey over the past year and a half has been not always the easiest. I imagine you guys in the room have lots of experience of working in various formats with a large coalition of people from different places, which sometimes means it's all hunky-dory and you think you know what you're doing, and other times means it feels pretty messy and you're like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? And I would say even personally, at the beginning of the process, it felt quite painful just to get started because you're in that unknown and you don't really know where you're going to go, and you have all these people that are all in the unknown together. But over time, this has become one of the most exciting things that I've worked on in my career, and I'm really excited to see what can happen with it. And so it was not always easy, but I am certainly very proud of where the group has gone. And I think it's been really nice because it's gotten to some place that no one individually could have gotten to. And it certainly wasn't gotten to some place that anyone in a room by themselves could have written down what happened. So there's a lot of involvement of lots of interesting people. So the invitation for today is for you guys to join in, to add your thoughts and perspectives, your questions, and your ideas into the mix so that we hopefully can move forward together in a much stronger way. All right. So to kick off the proceedings, would love to welcome up the Honorable Ian Hunter to give us an introduction and a beginning. So join me in welcoming to the stage.
Hi everybody. I'd like to, of course, pay my respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land that we meet on today, and acknowledge their ongoing spiritual relationship to country. Lots of very important people. I'll just zip through one or two of you. Sandy Pitcher, Chief Executive. Juna and my enabler. She's filled me up with coffee this morning, so I'm raring to go. Professor Richard Hobbs, the University of Western Australia. Sharon Starrick, presiding member of the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin NRM Board, whose name I took in vain several times today, but in a good way. Cecilia Wolford, Eyre Peninsula Integrated Climate Change Agreement Committee. Emily Jenke, presiding member, Native Vegetation Council. Professor Chris Daniels, presiding member, AMLR and NRM Board. Jill Woodlands, Conservation Council of SA, and Craig Wilkins, Conservation Council. Well, it's great to welcome all of you, so many of you here today, for our Nature of SA forum. Today's event, hopefully, will be an opportunity for all of you to discuss collectively our approaches to nature conservation into the future. I think most of us are here today, I hope you are here today, because you share a belief that looking after nature is important. Various reasons why it's important, and it'll differ from each of you, but I think we can all see that collectively we share that common goal. We know that protecting and preserving our natural environment for future generations underpins our future as a state, our future prosperity, our future health, and we also know that everything that we depend on for our ongoing life support systems really comes from a healthy environment. Clean air, clean water, fresh food, shelter, the very fundamental basis of a future. It also, of course, underpins our prosperity as a state, our economy, and probably, I think, the status of Adelaide and our state as being one of the most livable places in the world. National and international tourists come to our state to visit the marvels, from remarkable rocks on KI to Lake Eyre, spending their hard-earned dollars helping to support local communities and local jobs. We also know how important our natural environment is to people who live there. And our CBD, for example, surrounded by parklands, a metropolitan area nestled in between the hills and the sea. And a recent study of our community shows that 94% of the population will self-nominate that they believe that conserving the environment is of critical importance to them and their family. Now that's a pretty solid basis to be working from, basis of support. If I had those sorts of figures every election, every 4 years, I'd be pretty happy for my policy positions. So it gives us something to work with that is really unassailable if we can get our story right, if we can get our language right and the way we connect to our community. We already have their permission to do some of the work that we want to do. Now, of course, going back a few years, this is why we released our very first strategy, No Species Lost, a nature conservation strategy for South Australia in 2007. Incredibly successful, a great byline, a phrase you couldn't argue with, somewhat, I suppose, ambitious. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we're probably also being a bit fast and loose with the truth. But in terms of setting up a very clear message about what we were about doing, that was a fantastic header. The strategy was our first strategic policy on nature conservation with a vision for conserving and protecting biodiversity across landscapes and ecosystems in the face of a lot of challenges. And it cut through brilliantly well. It set, for us, a very, very ambitious target, one I think that will be sorely tested in years to come in terms of the challenges that we face from the impacts of climate change. But I think the strategy, as I said, highlighted the need for us to respond to climate change and laid the groundwork for our next phase. Now, changes to our ecosystems, I'm told by our scientists and our knowledgeable people, are pretty dramatic across our state. The latest data provided by the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology has found an overall warming of 0.9 degrees Celsius in Australia since 1910. And average temperatures across South Australia have been impacted by about the same amount. Now, if it was just a matter of a slightly balmier winter and a slightly hotter summer, we could all live with that. But those of us who know something about dynamic systems know that when you pour extra energy into a system like a weather system, a complicated system like that, it doesn't just mean warmer temperatures in winter. The fact is, the more energy you put into a system means it becomes more chaotic. And we will face more frequent and more extreme weather events than those we've already experienced in the last 12 months. So it is indeed timely that we revisit this No Species Lost strategy, I think, to think about how we might need to shift our thinking, to adapt our approaches to nature conservation in the light of what we're facing in terms of climate change. Hi, Celia. It has to work, I think, on many levels, and I alluded to the fact that our previous title, No Species Lost, worked exceptionally well in creating a direct communication with our community about what our ambitions were. We need a holistic approach that will speak to people, that wins the hearts and minds of South Australians and harnesses that 95%, 94% permission that we have to do the work that we want to do together. And this means, I think, really re-engaging with our community about how they utilise nature, making nature more accessible, helping our citizens find new ways to enjoy nature, to celebrate nature, to play in nature again. We need to build on the success of programs like Nature Play that helps families and schools and communities make nature activities an everyday part of our kids' lives. We have to continue to foster the links between nature and our health and our well-being through initiatives like our Healthy Parks, Healthy People program. And when I do engage with our agency going into health, the health department. It's incredible for me to see the willingness of health professionals to actually engage with us about how do we utilise our natural environment for well-being outcomes for community health. It's just fantastic to see the willingness and that agency to step aside from the day-to-day of making people better to thinking about how we can make people better in the longer term by engaging with the environment. Stakeholders and our broader community have to play a bigger role in decisions about their future. The future of our natural landscapes, the future about our policy positions across government. And we found in Juno that the more we actually go out and engage with our community, our stakeholders, but people, the ordinary citizenry, the better informed our policy positions are, and the more welcome our decisions in implementing our government policies are. And I was just out at Cobbler Creek on Saturday, a park that was a fantastic park, saved by an unknown at the time lowly electoral officer called Jennifer Rankin, who handcuffed herself to a Telstra tower and stopped bulldozers going in and setting up a residential development in what is an incredibly valued but underutilised community park. We've gone through our targeted investments in Cobbler Creek from about 1,300 visitors a month to something like 12,500 because of listening to the community, asking them what they want in their local park and then delivering it. And that's what we can do. We can get people out into parks and using them again as we might have done when we were younger by a bit of targeted investment and also listening to what people say to us, this is what we want. Don't provide these wonderful bells and whistles that we're never going to use. Provide us our basic facilities and we will respond. And they have. So I think we need to engage with our citizens. We need to lead them in the thinking about how do we actually get better environmental outcomes for our state. And if we can do that, we'll be doing it right. These partnerships have underpinned, I believe, the government's success, particularly with Juno and, for example, our climate change adaptation program right across the state. In 2015, as you know, a number of people were in Paris, including a number of Australian government representatives, to sign up to the Paris Accord. And we are very happy as a state to have been there with our Premier and various other players, including Sandy, who really were surprised, I think, to receive at this international forum a recognition that our state has played a very significant role, certainly in the realm of subnational governments, but even more broadly in terms of how we address climate change and how we have the discussion with our citizens. A highlight of the conference for me was our recognition, as I said, as a world leader for our actions to tackle climate change. Just amazing for me to be there in Paris and have the spotlight swivel on little old South Australia and what we're doing. But the truth is, it's quite remarkable what we've been able to do, particularly in working very close concert with the Adelaide City Council. There was that strong acknowledgement of the economic opportunities, of course, that can come from clean energy transition. And South Australia has already harnessed just over $7 billion worth of investment in renewable energy. And the important thing to understand is 40% of that investment stays in the regions where those renewables are built. Incredibly important that very important that it underwrites local communities and local economies into the longer term. It means more local jobs staying in those local communities, spending that income in local communities. And if it wasn't for South Australia's efforts and the efforts of other states, of course we know that the federal government would never be able to achieve the commitments that it signed up to in Paris in terms of emissions reductions. The investment pool I referred to earlier will grow. Bloomberg have told us there's about $7 trillion worth of investment swirling around in the world for renewables, looking for a home. And our desire is to try and get a little slice of that for South Australia. It will drive massive investment opportunities and jobs into our state. So in the same way as we've been able to do with our climate adaptation program, I believe we need, as a state, to become a leader in the nation at least, and probably in our region, in the terms of nature conservation. We can take the community with us on this endeavour because, as I mentioned earlier, we have their permission already. 94% of them self-volunteer that this is important. So today I really want to acknowledge all the hard work that has culminated in today's forum and for tomorrow. This forum, I think, is about how do we get where we want to be, forging partnerships amongst many stakeholders with government and the community and our citizens, and trying to drive this new demand for a change in how we address nature conservation, particularly with the challenges we're facing from climate change. thank you to everybody for being here. This is a fantastic turnout. These are difficult conversations we need to have, and with your input and your goodwill, I'm assured that I can look forward to hearing solutions and plans that you'll come up with today to take us forward. No pressure at all. Thank you very much.
To help us continue to set the scene, we're having a bit of a campfire chat and interview with the sponsors of our work, Sandy and Craig. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Yep, good. So, yes, we're not the two old men from the Muppets up here going, but we could be, yeah. We thought rather than having two set-piece speeches back-to-back, we'd actually rather have a more of an interactive conversation. So I can assure you we have not practiced a word. Yes, it'll be a bit of a winging it. But our job first up is to introduce each other. So to my right is Sandy Pitcher, who's the Chief Executive of the Department for Environment and Water and Natural Resources. And she's been in the job for 2 years now, and before that was working in the Department for Premier and Cabinet, where she was involved with the social inclusion unit, the cabinet area, Aboriginal Affairs and Reconciliation, and broadly about how governments engage with the community. And if you'll notice that she's a bit sleep deprived at the moment, it's because she's had 2 rough months of trying to watch as much live music as possible, and up to her 13th gig, apparently. So just trying to get out and about, doing her bit for Mad March early. So I'll pass the microphone over.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, to my left here is Craig Wilkins, known to many, if not all of you. Craig's been in the job at the Con Council for 3 years now, and he came to the Con Council from a mix of community, government and politics, so the perfect recipe, I think, for what we're talking about today. There's a dash of all of that in what we're trying to achieve. He was before that a community health nurse, so that was something I learnt through this process. And I don't know if many of you have seen Craig with his other aspiration, which is to become a famous Bollywood dancer. But when I was at the Christmas pageant last year and I was looking out into the thing, I went, that's Craig leading the Bollywood dancers. And again, he was at the Fringe Parade on Saturday night. So, you know, I think his fame is within his reach. It's growing. So as Craig said, we actually decided that, and it was actually us two who decided it all on our own, that rather than having 2 speeches to show what a good partnership we had in terms of leading this, it would probably feel a bit more real if we actually talked about what we're doing and why. And one of the things we've set ourselves today, so don't be too shocked if it happens, but we actually thought it would be really good to talk about some of the elephants in the room and some of the hard stuff, not just the good stuff. And I think the Minister and Ryan have set a great framing for that. But we also thought we needed to say some of the hard parts about what we're doing and some of, I suppose, that permission word that was up there that Craig and I are giving, we want to give as part of our opening today. So that's almost the goal we set ourselves. So do you want to talk a little bit, Craig? Do you want to start off about how this came to being from your sense of the side?
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. So we thought would be useful to chart a bit of a story about how this came about from each of our perspectives. And for me, it's very much around the importance of having a ritual, a moment actually of bringing people together that is different to an ongoing conversation. You actually need to actually have these moments, whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's a wedding or a big birthday or something. But just it brings out different types of things. And I've been fascinated by in the last week or so, in particular the last 24 hours, there's been a whole flurry of emails and conversations emerging as people sort of go, oh, what's all this about? What's really going on? And it forces people to actually pay attention and do something more. So this idea of a ritual, I think, is really, really, really important. And for me, I mean, I think the starting point is recognising that we're losing. Like, if we were winning the conversation around the importance of nature, the importance of nature protection, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. But in recognising that we're not winning, we have to maybe look at doing things differently. And from my perspective, a big genesis of being here today was when Sandy first began the role 2 years ago. In our first meeting together, we talked about where the big lie of the land, and both recognised that the Environment Department was hurting across government and cabinet in terms of getting political support. We as the NGO voluntary community sector were hurting in terms of engaging with the community, and we both had a very, very similar desire to re-engage those different parts of the community. So, and the thought was, well, it makes sense for us to do this together. There's no point in us doing one thing and you guys doing another, but actually let's try and pool resources and bring out the best in both.
And and that definitely was a shared big picture for me, but there was a particular moment, and Craig was talking about those memories of moments where we brought together what were the ENGOs and Juna for a very early early in my time in Juna conversation, I think just over at the Botanic Gardens, and we were talking about how we can work together, and I can't even remember what the full focus of the event was, but in the course of that, it was really made clear to me that especially from many of the environment NGOs, they felt like as a department, Juna came up with policies and then came and consultation was very much a here you go at the end. And that, I think the nature-based tourism strategy discussion was probably the kind of firestone that set that off. But we actually started to have a really tough but kind of no-holds-barred conversation about, well, how does that feel to everyone on both sides of this? Is that what it feels like for the NGOs? Is that what it feels like in Juna? And if it is, how did we come to this? And if that is a sense of the perception, whether it was felt by everyone or not, how do we change it? What's going to be the thing that actually flicks that switch to working together differently rather than just sort of holding that sense of, oh, they're well-meaning but they don't listen to us, and here they come again at the end, but I suppose it's tough for them because they're part of government. How did we break that? And so actually doing the brave thing, and I think it is brave and it was deliberately supposed to be brave, of saying where is a policy area that we both have a shared interest in, that isn't predetermined, that isn't over yet, and we're not 2 years late already before we start in delivering it, that actually needs to have an honest rethink, and where we actually do work together from the start, and that we're partners in this, not government coming and saying, this is what I need and help us. And so we really have deliberately tried to make this feel entirely different from the old way of doing things. And I say that in inverted commas. And I hope that for those of you who have been involved so far, some of those elements have come, because it was a sense of deficit that we were starting from, not just the deficit of where the state of nature was, but the deficit of how was it that the government and the community sector were working together, and what did that feel like, and why didn't it feel like it was working as well as it should?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's certainly when I started in this role, I was quite struck by how much heat there was around the relationship between the NGO sector and Juno. There was a lot of hurt certainly from our side, a lot of disappointment, and I think a degree of sort of holding on to past battles and past conversations, and a feeling of being let down, and finding a way to actually break through that allows more interesting conversations to take place. And certainly the other thing for me is around I'm sick of all the reactive battles around nature. I'm having to sort of do the rearguard actions to protect little bits of legislation, or while there's a big sense that there's a larger, stronger, more powerful conversation which is going in the opposite direction. And if we can try and have a game changer around that, that would be pretty awesome. So, in terms of what struck you around the process so far, and what's jumped out for you from the consultation that's taken place?
Well, I think in terms of the surprises, I mean, I think there's a one that has been quite strong, and it might come up again a lot, but I think it's really worth mentioning, was just the recognition of what a personal journey this has been for many people in terms of actually, I suppose, thinking about the impacts of climate change and the state of where nature's got to. So very much the content of where we are getting to, about that there has been loss, and something like no species loss might be an aspiration that dies in our lifetimes because of the impact of climate change. And what does that mean for the way that people, all of us, have probably started from where we were 10 years ago to where we might be now. And I suppose intellectually I had been thinking about that, but the personal part, the recognition that there's a lot of emotion and personal, I suppose, histories for all of us in what that means of changing something so big and so core, and recognising that not everyone's going to have the same core changes there, but that this process has probably uncovered and sort of unearthed a lot of things that weren't necessarily there on the page. And that was a little bit of a surprise for me, but I actually think it's part of what's made this so strong and so deep, and why so many people are committed. But it has actually taken, in some senses, a life of its own, both deep for people as well as for us, as how we work together. So that's definitely one surprise. And I think for me the other, it's a personal reflection, but it's a role that I need to think about, is how important the role that you play, whether it's chief exec or minister or whatever, about being clear about permission and letting people have that confidence of going and doing something without feeling like that you're suddenly going to be in trouble later. You know, true permission, not just permission until it suits someone, until it goes wrong. And that recognising that can't just be said once, and it has to be lived and demonstrated. And so that's one of the things that I'm personally trying to think about and reflect as part of this. But what about you, Craig? What were your surprises?
Yeah, I actually had quite a few, and I was so impressed with the level of consultation that went on, and the really interesting themes that brought up. But I suppose the biggest one is around, and the one that has the most heat, is around the whole idea of novel ecosystems. And essentially, I think the challenge for a lot of people is this big question of, are we giving up? I mean, especially for people from the sort of community sector, they've defined themselves and their lives in a huge way, in terms of we are the sentinels. We're the ones who stand up and fight the battle when all was lost. The Jennifer Rankins who chained themselves to the power pole. Like that's our we've always seen it as our role. And when any sort of conversation like this comes along, there's a big part of me that, and obviously a big part of other people as well, feels like somehow we are giving in or letting go or not following through on that, and that's bloody hard. That's really hard to challenge that. But yet there is this appetite for the conversation and the hunger for it. I think for me it's very much around taking control rather than being reactive, and I think that's really exciting. The idea of the storytelling, the myth, the narrative is key, and I think from our perspective, the critical importance of the voluntary sector and the community sector. The government can't do it alone. They need us, and so we're there. And I absolutely agree with you around the emotion and the grief. And I've been at meetings with people who've been involved in this, who have caught tearing up because of the enormity of this kind of stuff. The place it is inside people is so strong that sometimes it catches you around that emotion. So what about the elephants? The elephants in the room? What do you reckon they're all thinking now?
I reckon if I was a public servant, I am, that's right, when it suits me. For those of you in the room, I reckon, that's all well and good, except what if the politicians of the day change, or what if the minister of the day changes, or the government, or how does that all work, and what if you go, Sandy, what does that mean? And I reckon that is a big elephant in the room, and obviously I can't guarantee many of the above things there. I do reflect, though, that really good work done well between lots of people is pretty hard to unravel. And for me, the example I use and think about is community engagement and the expectation that we as a government and we as a community sector have raised amongst people about what they expect from their governments, what they expect in terms of consultation, not just being told something and that's it, but actually having that deeper and different engagement, and that being the normal part of life. I don't think that's going to be unravelable by anyone into the future, because expectations in the community have changed and we've been all part of changing them. So for this Nature of SA work and beyond, if we can set ourselves that sense that there's a whole lot of people from all of these different walks of life and we've engaged in something brave because of what we care about, and it's not something that has a left and a right or a binary yes or no, black or white, but it's actually a journey, a big conversation, it's a way of thinking, and it's changing the way we just approach things just as a this is how it is and that's what we do. That's why I think that it's worth having faith that this just won't unravel tomorrow. But I can't promise it, but I can talk about all of the ways and the preconditions that we all together can do to make sure that things don't just unravel when there's a change of something wherever it is. What about you, Craig?
Yeah, got a few, but I actually want to ask you one about how genuine, from Junior's perspective, is this co-design process? Really, I suppose, what's the real process within government to make sure that this isn't taken over at some stage?
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of ways to measure genuineness, and so I could tell you the different ones. I mean, one of them is actually the way I think that the executive and junior staff have been involved. So I hope for everyone who's been involved with people along the way, they've seen that just as many people in the room have been on that journey, lots of junior staff personally have been on that journey too, and that grief and loss has been very real for staff who've had their whole career thinking about these issues. I think that it's worth knowing, this is such an internal government thing, but every month on a Tuesday afternoon without fail, we have an executive leaders group in Juna that comes together, and we do that, and it's our executive meeting, and we've changed that this month to be here at the Nature of SA forum rather than have that executive meeting. And I think in the 2 years that I've been in the role, we haven't changed it for any other reason. So I think that that's just one of those things that we have done for this purpose and for that sense of us all wanting as an executive and our staff to engage in a different way. So I suppose there's big signals and there's small ones, the minister being here, myself and others talking, but there's also those ways that the time and energy and effort, which are some things that are hard to measure, but I think you can see in people's actions, and I think if you can measure us on that, that would hopefully give you some confidence that this is not just another thing that's tucked away.
Great. Just thinking about some other elephants. I remember recently some members of the Liberal right challenged Malcolm Turnbull around his use of the word innovation, or in a new innovative economy, and they said every time people hear the word innovation, they think job loss. And I think equally in this context, every time we hear innovation around nature systems or challenging that, there's a fear that it's about loss. It's about actually less than before, less resources, trying to do too much with not enough. And I suppose that whole idea of change is hard, and I suppose most people's experience over the last few years is that change has tended to be not better than it was before. So I think that's an elephant that's in the room. I've certainly heard, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking that our organisation, the Conservation Council, is somehow sold out and are too cosy to Juna. Why aren't you doing fighting the hard battles rather than this kind of cozying up? So that, I think, is perhaps in people's heads as well. And maybe in response to that, I do believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can actually have this kind of relationship conversation and try and do things together differently, but also fight when required. And I mean, I think on Wednesday there's a group of us, Pete and Melissa and others, are going into the Minister's office to having a bit of a conversation about the pullback of some of our nature laws that are going on in Parliament at the moment. So we can do both, I think. There's been a thought around all talk, no action, and what Ryan was describing in terms of that initial process. There's been a lot of conversations going on. So when's it actually going to turn into something more? Get on with it. Are we just talking to ourselves? That sort of thing. There's been a challenge around this airbrushing the debate. Are we trying to sort of push ahead with one direction and not recognise that there's a lot of different people thinking a lot of different things in this space around novel ecosystems and no species loss and holding tight and strong? I think there's that. What else is there? Oh, and I think a big one is the fact that if you look in Parliament, there are a series of pullbacks in our nature protection legislation. And for the people who've actually fought really long and hard to put them in place, when talking about native vegetation regulations, talking about different parts of different acts, there's a lot of attacks going on. And so we want to make sure that this process actually informs writing it into Parliament and making sure it's there for the long term. So, I think there's a lot of people thinking, it's all very well and good talking about the nice stuff around nature, but if it means that tomorrow a really important bit of protection is going to be stripped away, then that's actually more important to fight that battle rather than do this. And it's that whole classic prevention versus is it better to ambulance in the emergency room versus find disease, the whole lot. So we've really got to have that, I think, that feisty conversation, and I really hope that the next 2 days is around that, actually pulling that stuff out. So we've probably talked, sorry Ryan, far too long.
No, that's great, you're perfectly on time. And maybe some final words. Okay,
so just to finish off, our job was to leave you inspired and excited. So, so how are you feeling now? I might just hand it back to Sandy because I'm sure she could do a better job.
So, Craig, my question is, do you not have anything inspiring to say? No, of course you do. No, well, we did, Craig and I also did say that while uncovering the elephants in the room, we didn't want to leave it that was the place, that raw place, without having a sense of optimism, given that we both do. And so my sense is that being here today is a very important thing and a very important milestone, and Craig talked about that sense of occasion, and I think hopefully that we do actually manage to create lots of occasions and special senses out of today's conversation. I am really optimistic that this can be something that we all feel that we've had a contribution to and feel pretty proud of, and that I don't think it's going to just be static. And that to me is a very powerful thing. And so it depends where all of the different trains go, but I imagine that this can get much bigger. It already has, I think, become a much bigger project in many of our minds than it perhaps started out as, and that inspires me to see what our collective action today and tomorrow might bring there. So I definitely say that don't worry, every time Craig and I meet, there is a long list of things that we debate and don't agree on. The hard conversations still happen, but that sense that actually, what are we fighting? Is it bigger than just us two in the room? Always feels pretty important to me, and there is a very big community effort that I think we need to make. It's the place where I hold the biggest optimism and the biggest pessimism in two hands around how do we engage the community around the environment, and how do we make them not just turn off to something like climate change that feels just a bit politically too hard, and so people just stop engaging. So that's really where my optimism sits, and I hope that that's where, after a couple more days of conversation, we really move on to the next phase.
Thanks, Sandy. In terms of my optimism, for me, this is one of the rare areas of hope in the whole nature and biodiversity area. I'm genuinely excited about what could emerge through the storytelling, through the willingness to take some risks and try different things in order to do things better. I'm really inspired by the quality of the people. I mean, looking around the room, it's a bit of a who's who of nature conservation in South Australia. So congratulations to you all for being here, because it's fantastic that you've recognised the importance of this conversation. And there's amazing work going on here already. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants in in many ways, and particularly in terms of the quality of people. I'd like to acknowledge, from our perspective, in particular, Vicky Jo Russell as the co-chair of the working group, and Jill Woodlands from my organisation, who've really, those two have been particularly influential in terms of trying to work with our sector and bring them along board. I'm inspired by the courage of people to actually engage in this, because it is scary for some, and also the power of working together that I think offers much more than a part. Practically, this is just the start of a whole lot of other stuff. This isn't just a one-off forum. It's a beginning of a process, and one of those bits of process is that we, as a community sector, get together and talk about what we want to achieve out of the state election coming up in March 2018. That's a very practical conversation which needs to follow on. So, don't be in any doubt that this stops here. This is actually just very much the beginning. So thank you everyone for your courage and commitment to be here, and we wish you all the very, very best for the next day and a half.